Hey people, we got this going. Yeah, so here it is, March 11th now, 2:46 a.m. and I'm gonna make probably a more abbreviated version of my journey in Mormonism. For those of you that don't want to watch something for 2 hours that I made a while back, but it is one of my highest viewed, as far as time goes, videos. So I just joined a Facebook group, ex-Mormons or something like that, and they wanted a little intro as to who I am, what my journey, about my journey in Mormonism. So I'm not gonna look at my face very long. We'll just go do this kind of podcasty style, and I guess I'll just submit that to that group, and hopefully I can create something that'll be a little, encapsulate some of the important things, maybe not some of the too many of the stories, and making it quite so long this time. All right, let's do that. Middle of the night. That's we don't have great lighting, so I'm not gonna bother with all that. Let's do this. Throw it on my website or something here, right? You can look at the Statue of Liberty. Okie doke. Well, so I didn't happen to be born in the covenant. I wasn't born a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I wasn't born into a Christian home, but I was born to goodly parents. I could say. There were problems in our home, though. There were problems. So both of my parents were zoology majors, and my mom had come from a home where they went to the Swedish Covenant Church some of the time when she was growing up, which involves a lot of singing, I understand, and it has kind of a lay participation format where so it's less formal than when you've got a preacher up there all the time, I think. And she went to a convent school because whatever reasons she thought it was going to be useful. My father grew up in a home that didn't seem very religious, but I guess he went to some Baptist style meetings occasionally. My dad had a major drinking problem for my entire time I was growing up. My parents split up when I was about 5.5. So my introduction to religion, I could say, would be I started reading the Bible when I was about 4 years old. I was taught to read when I was 4 by my mom, and I had what they called it wasn't really little. It was kind of a big golden Bible, so it had pictures in it and Bible stories, and I still remember impressions I had reading and looking at the pictures and so on and so forth. I wasn't real impressed with the God of the Old Testament. The stories tended to be violent and not very compassionate. I became deeply concerned with death when I viewed on November 22nd, 1963, I was sitting on the couch alone in the family, what we could call the family room, whatever you want to call this room. But I was by myself watching the presidential parade, and I watched John F. Kennedy get blown away. And that was kind of my introduction to death that I recall. was quite disturbing to me as a young child, and I became concerned about dying and about religion. So my parents split up, and then we moved to the East Coast, where I basically was being raised by my grandparents. My mother was very sick for a while, for quite some time. I remember Mrs. McLean, the lady next door, died, and I was very upset because the whole death thing was, like I said, very disturbing to me. When we came back to California, about a year after we'd been back, I asked to go to church. I believe we went to a Lutheran church a couple of times. I wasn't real satisfied with that experience. About that time, I decided I'd had it with this Bible God guy, and pretty much didn't resume much until we moved out of that area, and my new best friend's dad was a reverend for the Methodist Church, and I attended some of their meetings, and I went to their youth stuff, and I was somewhat interested in some of the sermons. He asked me if I wanted to be baptized, and I just didn't feel that he had any special priesthood authority. Yeah, I actually felt that way. I wasn't super impressed that they had any special spirituality, or that he did. Nice enough family, but compared to what the Jesus character was cranked up to be, I wasn't impressed. So they moved away, and I had a good friend down the street, and then an acquaintance from 6th grade came by one afternoon when my mom had left for San Diego, which was several hours away, to go check up on her folks, see how her parents were doing. I guess my brothers went with my dad, or she dropped them off at his place near LA, and I was alone for the weekend, around the 8th grade summer. So I asked my friends if maybe they'd like to spend the night, play Monopoly or something like that, and that was kind of the plan. And then the guy from a few blocks down started telling some experiences of some other guys that lived near him, of rather demonic nature. So, long story short, a presence entered the house that was extremely frightening, and my friends both said, "You know what, we're out of here. We're not staying. You're on your own, pal." And so there I was by myself, and the feeling in the house was really not good. And my mom was in this nutritional cleaning, this natural products multi-level marketing company, and making her living at that. And some of the people in that were Christian and had left Gideon New Testaments at our home, and I elected to give a phone call to a gal who was a Baptist, who was the lady ranking above my mom in the organization. And I gave her a call, and I told her, there's something in this house that is not good, and my friends are they left, and I'm all alone, and I was looking to her for a little spiritual guidance, and she said, why don't you bust out a New Testament and start reading the Book of Matthew? So I did. And what happened was rather interesting. a light seemed to enter the room. The atmosphere changed, and that bad spirit left, and I began to feel a belief that perhaps what I was reading was true. So there I was all alone, and that began a time in my life when I started reading out of the New Testament. I basically put religion away, put the Bible away, and all that sort of a thing for a number of years at that point. And so I began doing my own reading, and I decided that I needed to be a person who was more in line with the preachings of the Jesus character of the New Testament, less inclined to be cursing my neighbors, even though some of them were quite obnoxious, and just trying to be as good a person as I could be. And I had read in the second chapter of the book of James, I believe, that our works were very important. And I believe it was there that I read that the tongue is like the rudder of a ship, a small organ that has a large effect. And I thought, well, I'm pretty prone to some fairly vitriolic speech at times, and I thought I should try to improve upon that. And it was about this time that my mom got invited by another member of this MLM, and also a member of the John Birch Society, whose meetings I attended as well, with the idea that we were trying to preserve freedom and the Bill of Rights and that sort of a thing from subversive forces. So this gal came by with her two sons, and was on the doorstep talking to my mom, and invited her to go to this Mormon open house at the meeting house that where folks went to church. And my mom was all set to say, I'll let you know if I'm interested, folks. But a pillar of light surrounded the three people on the doorstep, and she heard words come out of her mouth that were not hers, and they were, "I will be there." And she's like, how did that happen? Now I'm stuck. So she went, and she saw stuff about food storage and genealogy, and I don't know, families can be together forever. I don't know what all she saw, but she thought it was pretty interesting. And then as she was leaving, a man came kind of out of the shadows from just outside the door, and it was a man she knew, and he was also in the same MLM, but he wasn't in my mom's group. And he asked her, "Hey, so what did you think?" And she evidently indicated that she was pretty impressed. And then he said, "Well, would you like to know more?" And she said, "Sure." I think on that occasion also she was planning to say, but she said yes. And so this gentleman and his friend, or his companion, as they're called in LDS vernacular, came by. They were lifetime missionaries. Their calling in the church was called the Office of 70 in the priesthood, and it was traditional at that time for a number of people to be called to that calling without them being what we call general authorities in the church. That practice has since been discontinued, but so these were just lay priesthood guys. Both of them, well, actually, I don't think I'm going to leave that detail. But anyway, so they came by, and they started giving us lessons about Mormonism. And the two presentations, or discussions as they're called, that kind of hit me the hardest were the first couple. And at that time, the first one was about Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, and a vision that he said he had with the Christian God, or the Hebrew God, and his son Jesus. I don't know if we can say that's the Christian God, because it had nothing to do with the Trinity doctrine, but they were separate and distinct individuals. So I recall them showing me a picture, and many pictures, but a picture of Joseph Smith and various pictures depicting what they were talking to us about on what was called a flip chart. And I felt real impressed with what they were saying. I found it very interesting, and then the next time around, like I said, they gave us a talk called the plan of salvation. So it basically gave an outline of Mormonism's take on giving us a reason why we are alive. In other words, answering the questions that they had in a particular movie called Man's Search for Happiness, which were, why am I alive? Why are we here? What's it all about? And where do we go after we die? That kind of a thing. So these are questions that would be, fairly important, and basically gave us a reason for our existence. And this really, kind of answered some of the questions I had already formulated in my mind regarding, hey, what's it all about, right? Because I'd done a fair amount of reading in the New Testament, and I just really didn't see a whole lot of purpose for anything. And this gave the Mormon plan that, hey, we lived before we came to this earth. We lived as spirit children. We formed relationships, and then we were, going to try to continue those relationships later on after we died. And Mormonism provided an opportunity for families to continue their relationships. But to backtrack just a little, after the very first discussion, after the missionary guys left, after these two left, I asked my mom, did you notice anything kind of out of the ordinary in that presentation tonight? She said, yeah. And I said, what was it? And she said, I saw a light around one of the guys. And I said, which one of the guys did you see the light around? And she named the same guy that I saw the light around. So we were both kind of like, wow. We had both seen a light around one of the two guys. My brothers, as far as I know, didn't have any such experience. So that was kind of the start of our introduction to Mormonism, and as a matter of fact, we continued to have lessons or visits for a year and a half without getting baptized. And then about a year and a half into it, we went and saw a live play in Los Angeles called Saturday's Warrior, which depicted this Mormon plan of salvation and a group of people, most of them a family, on this journey from what's called the premortal life in Mormonism through mortality, and then the hereafter, basically. And in Mormonism, that isn't like straight going to, what Christians call heaven or something. It's going to kind of one of two places, a purgatory kind of place, either a spirit prison or hell, if you or the good place, a paradise, a paradisical place that is heavenly, but you haven't quite made it yet. But you're on the way. So until the resurrection, that is part of the Mormon version of Christian doctrine there. So there you are, progressing through your eternal exaltation plan. And for me, that it really helped me to visualize probably, the whole deal. And of course, these were really important things to me, and I was kind of set up for this sort of a thing by the fact that our family split up when I was a little kid, which had greatly disturbed me. So on the way back, my mom, tells the guy who had the light around him, and we spent the night with his sister's family or something. She tells him she's ready to be baptized, and so she was shortly thereafter baptized, and a month later I was. So I was like 15 years old. This was 1975. One of my brothers got baptized. The other one elected not to. He said, listen, I'm not going to do those commandments, so there's no sense in me doing this. So that's kind of how that went. And so we started going to we were already going to church. So we became members of a particular ward, which was not the ward that these guys were from, which we had been attending, because in Mormonism, it's geographically determined where your congregation is. And these fellows that started this process with my mom were not in the same boundaries, the same congregational boundaries, called a ward, like I said. So that was kind of a letdown for us, because it was more boring ward, the Sunday school music and that sort of a thing, the sacrament music. It was just it was less upbeat. It was not upbeat a lot of the time. It was just stuff that was kind of depressing. So anyway, we got involved with that, and not long thereafter, I was reading in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants, what was considered to be a revelation to Joseph Smith, section 89, which is called the Word of Wisdom in Mormonism, and basically called the Lord's Law of Health. Joseph Smith, we were taught, received this revelation, helping people understand some important health laws, things to avoid, and mostly things to avoid, with the encouragement of drinking beer. It just didn't say beer. It said mild drinks of barley. And that happened to be the point that that was my point of concern at that night, as I was reading in a particular chair, the same chair that I had been in when that light came in and I was kind of delivered, or the house became free of that really dark spirit. So there we were. There I was. And I read mild drinks of barley are good for you. And I'm like, that's beer. Why have they been telling me that beer was, that any alcoholic drinks were not okay? Little did I know at the time that, it wasn't it was considered just as it read until Prohibition hit in 1920. And then I guess the Mormon leadership decided it means something a little different than what it says, and so all alcoholic beverages were then basically declared of the devil. So I looked at that and I said, well, that's not what this says. So I suppose some opportunities came along about that time, or had previously, or actually I got drunk as a 3-year-old once. My folks left a glass of wine out, and I downed the whole thing. I actually don't remember that. There are things I do remember from that time, but not that. I do remember my dad handing me a beer when we were going down the freeway in his Corvette convertible. It was a 7-ounce Coors. Yeah, they had 7-ouncers. And I guess he didn't want to drink too heavily while he was driving, but I don't know, he saw CHP or something, California Highway Patrol. So he handed me his beer, and I polished it off for him. Anyway, about the time that I'm discussing, though, I guess our friend, the same guy who was, my closer friend, that decided to not hang out that night after the other fellow told that story. He and my brothers and I took a long bicycle ride to another city, over a mountain or over a hill, a grade, and along the way, we found beer 3 separate times. Can you believe that? 3 separate times. We found an Olympia, we found a Colt 45, and we found a Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. Yeah, so we drank all those. And I don't remember exactly what the timing that was on getting baptized and so forth. But from that experience, I remember Pabst Blue Ribbon seemed to be the best of those. And so probably shortly after this experience, when I was reading the Word of Wisdom and realized that Spencer Kimball and the boys were enforcing something contrary to the scriptures, I decided to place a 6-pack of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer in the underside of the shopping cart when my brothers and mom and I were out shopping one evening. I also took it upon myself to point out to my mom the barbecue coals over across the way, and suggested maybe we needed some of those to barbecue while the lady was packing the beer in the bag, thus distracting my mother at just the right time. And of course, when she said, no, we don't really need any of those briquettes, we've already got some, I said, okay, whatever, Mom. And I was real helpful and carried the bag in, so she never saw what she had purchased at that time. And at any rate, that was I was easing myself into going against what the brethren were teaching. There I was, 15, just about the time I turned 16. And in addition, so that kind of introduced me into, okay, now, and I may have drank enough of them at one time where I caught a pretty good buzz. So my mom also, in her kindness to my uncle, had stored a bottle of his fine Canadian whiskey in the pantry, and it was just there. You'd open the pantry to get some bread or something, and you were looking at that whiskey. And one day, my friends were available. My friend that I mentioned, a couple times already, and his brother, who was also my friend, they were over, and no one else was over. And we opened up that pantry, maybe to make a sandwich or something, and there was the whiskey. And I thought, you know what? Does it really matter if it's beer or whiskey? So we drank that whiskey, took a walk down a trail of an undeveloped area, and got pretty hammered. After that, I thought, well, okay, now I'm quite the sinner. So it just became a little bit of a pattern. I had a new friend from school, and we got in the habit the next school year, at the beginning of school, beginning of the school year, to catch a little buzz before the football games on Friday night. Then one Friday night, he said, boys, I got something different, and he had marijuana. And I felt really bad about partaking of that. I felt very nervous when I did. I've since many times I thought, man, I shouldn't have done that. Now I feel completely different about weed, but at that time, thought I was doing a bad thing. Tried to clean my system out of it, do some herbal cleansing and that sort of a thing, but I repeated that in various other situations and began to feel like I was just terrible sinner now. So when the bishop asked me about, advancing in the priesthood to become a priest, because I was now 16, I said, nope, not interested. I was aware of, other young men that were blessing the sacrament. For those of you who may not be Mormon, so that's, kind of the bread and, well, it's usually bread and wine, but in the Mormon church, it had changed from bread and wine to bread and water, presumably when they got into that all alcohol is bad thing, without changing the scripture, just kind of reinterpreting it. So even though actually the revelation stated that wine should be used for that, so some of these guys were doing that, yet they weren't following what Mormonism taught was the right way. They were drinking, and some of them were popping pills, smoking weed, that kind of a thing. So I figured what they were doing was kind of hypocritical. I didn't want to be doing that. And so I told the bishop, nah, not interested. So for about a year and a half, or a couple of years there, I was not really into the whole church thing. And because I figured I was a bad boy if I was doing any of that sort of a thing. However, I decided that I needed to make a change. Actually, I can throw down I wonder how many stories. I'm trying to make this kind of short, but I did have some spiritual experiences that I feel like it's kind of important to relate, because when we get to the point where I'm realizing that the LDS scriptures are filled with contradiction, including things that are quoting the New Testament character Jesus Christ, then the cognitive dissonance that sets in is really amplified by the fact that I had these multiple spiritual experiences that I interpreted as being very confirmatory that I was in fact in the one true church, the one path to eternal life. So some of these experiences were pivotal in that. I just don't know if I want to lay them all down here and have this go too long. So, about the time I was 16, however, and I had smoked pot a few times, I thought, you know what, I'm going to buy myself a little bag of weed, and I had this thought and this intention, and I went to bed, went to sleep one night about this time while that was a concern in my head, and I dreamed 3 dreams. And the first 2 dreams involved me being with friends, and everybody was like smoking weed, and everyone was just so happy. And then the third dream was different. In the third dream, I got to a point where I was sitting on the floor, and my dad was like running his fingers through my hair and just sorrowing over the fact that I was mentally screwed up from having been damaged by drug use. And so there I was, a semi-basket case from drug abuse in my dream, and my dad sorrowing over the the loss of what a waste my life was. So I woke up from that and sat up in my bed in the dark. It's still middle of the night, right? And I'm sitting there in my bed thinking about this, going, wow, maybe I shouldn't buy that weed, right? And then it seemed like a thick darkness gathered in the room. It's very similar to the Joseph Smith story, just prior to the first vision business, where he says thick darkness gathered all around me. And I'm like, whoa, what the hell is this? And then boom, I was pushed down basically on, onto my back in my bed. And I was frightened. I was scared. And I thought I was kind of a tough kid, but I was scared. And so I'm like, I'm just going to scream for mom here. This is scary. But I couldn't. I could not make a sound. And then I was really terrified. I was being held down. I did not have the ability to sit back up. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't scream. And I was really scared. And then a voice spoke to me and said, if you choose to do that, you will deliver yourself to the powers that hold you now. About a second or 2 seconds later, boom, that presence cleared out of the room, and I was at liberty to do whatever I want to do, sit up and whatnot. And sorry for saying whatnot. No, I'm not a Utahn. Okay, so I then thought, okay, well, it's gone. No reason to, bother my mom. I'll just go back to sleep. So in that experience, I had a distinct impression. I had a distinct, like a visitation from an extremely frightening and evil power, and then what I interpreted as being the Holy Ghost speaking to me, basically saying, okay, this is what you're heading towards if you make that decision. And then boom, I was delivered from the evil power. So that's a pretty strong experience, making a young person at that point feel like, okay, well, the devil wants you to smoke weed, and God, the Israelite God doesn't want you to, and you've been warned. So I did not buy I didn't buy the pot at that time, but gradually I started smoking weed again, and eventually I did wind up buying some pot. I didn't need to most of the time because I wound up being given a large amount of marijuana because someone else's dad was going to take their plants down that he'd planted with them, and were like 7 feet tall. So I had like the extreme homegrown harvest at my house eventually. I'm not going to go through all that, but I went from an occasional pot smoker to a several times a day getting stoned person, and that happened for a while there during my high school years. So there came a point where I felt that I needed to make a change. Some rather dramatic things occurred, including an experience. Well, actually, I guess what I could say is that my mom was trying to help her boys turn things around. She wasn't too happy. She found, shortly after I started smoking weed, I found out my brothers were already smoking weed, and they were younger than me, right? So anyway, long story short, we were all getting high and not really into Mormonism. So during that time, I started surfing, and it's part of the culture, all that kind of a thing. So there I was, hanging out with my friends, getting high, doing all that kind of stuff, and then I graduated high school, and I took maybe like a semester off, and then one of the guys from church, another 70, came by, and he's like, hey, so what are you doing? What, you think about going to college? And I was like, you know what? Okay, I'll go to college I'll check out the college. I'd done a little bit of work and different things, and I said, oh, I'll go to the college. And about that time, it was before I went to the college, actually. I had an extreme experience, another extreme spiritual experience, and things got really bad as far as a presence that was accompanying me and building inside me. And it was following an occasion where I mimicked a pose on a particular album cover. The pose is basically, the same thing you'd see in drawing down the moon, except for the hand signs I was using with both hands are associated with the dark side. Anyway, just a power just came into me incredibly strong, and I felt for several days, and actually the entire time that this lasted, that I had strength to, do things I couldn't do before. Just a tremendous feeling of energy and power inside me, but there was a tension with it, and it wasn't good. And there were really bad messages being communicated to me, and at a particular point there, about the time we had a family prayer, I received a message that said basically that I needed to make a choice, or else really, really bad things were going to happen, and I'd be responsible for what demons did through my body. That's what I was essentially told. And so I had to come to grips with what I wanted to do, and I made a decision to make a change, to do what I could to get rid of that power that was accompanying me. So I went outside and I prayed, got on my knees and I prayed, and I was left basically limp. That power left, and I had like no energy, and I just felt limp. But I felt at peace. So I felt like I had been delivered from the possession of a demonic entity. So this was pretty this was pretty intense. And about that time, I decided I was going to make some changes with my partying business, and I shortly thereafter I stopped smoking pot. So anyway, I started going to the school, and I found myself in the company of a couple of girls on at the school and on the bus. One that I knew pretty well, and the other one I just knew who she was basically from when I had gone to the Methodist Church. And of course, when I was eighth grade, she was a foot taller than me, and now we were about the same height. And I saw her getting onto the bus, and a voice spoke to me and said, "If you keep my commandments, she's yours." And I thought, wow, how about that? Well, about a week later, and I was no longer living at my mother's house, but I was living about a block away with a family. The father was a master mason, and his daughter had been the queen of the Job's daughters. Anyway, so had the young lady I watched get onto the bus, and she and her friend showed up at the door. And my brother, who was visiting from the next block over, was repairing surfboard dings with me. We were doing a little ding repair, and these girls came by and said they'd like to rescue us and take us out on the town. It was a Friday night, and apparently in a conversation on the half-hour bus ride from our town to the school, or on the way back, I had related the fact that my vehicle was down. My engine needed to be rebuilt or something at that time. So they came to pick us up, and evidently the gal that was the other girl had well, she kind of wanted, she had intentions of a relationship with me, but that's not the way it worked out. I got in the front seat when I was basically given the choice, which seat do you want, front or back, and I took the front and my brother took the back, and from there started a relationship that wound up in my first marriage. So I was very concerned right off the bat because with where this relationship would go, and I was kind of already on a comeback trail with the church. So I informed the young lady that there wouldn't be any premarital sex happening, even though I still, drank alcohol and at that point still smoked weed, but that was just for maybe a week or two into our relationship, and then I quit. So at any rate, I was very concerned about this whole business. I wanted to make sure that I had it straight, so I was up all night, and I read the entire Book of Moses, as it's called, the 8 chapters of the Book of Moses, which is 8 chapters of Genesis, recomposed by Joseph Smith. They call it translated, but it's basically just altered some things, added story about Enoch and so on and so forth. And so this was my spiritual food for the night, I suppose. And so I was reading that and listening to a particular record album. It wasn't religious, but there was a song called "Jesus Came Down" in that particular album. It was a cassette tape, so it was just kind of repeating, I guess. Pretty sure it was cassette. Could have been 8-track. I think it was cassette though. Anyway, it was about the time cassettes came out. So I was listening to this, and I came to the conclusion that I needed to pray for strength to change my life, to be able to stop smoking pot, etc. And I wanted a real sure answer regarding the Mormon code of behavioral control regarding sexual conduct. So called the law of chastity in Mormonism, because basically you're told it's a law from the Israelite God that you don't participate in anything of a sexual nature outside of legal marriage. So I was praying about all this stuff, and I had kind of a vision where I came to the understanding, the belief that it was kind of a sacred part of a relationship and should be reserved for marriage. I also began to pray for strength to, do whatever was right. And I was kind of pleading for my soul, basically, for strength, because I felt like it'd be really hard to quit smoking pot at that point. And I was praying for quite a while. And at some point there, at 4 o'clock in the morning, actually, on what was then, what had changed to the 7th of April, I started this process on the 6th of April, which is kind of a big deal in Mormonism, because they say it's the birth date of the New Testament character, Jesus Christ, in LDS theology. So there I was, and at that point, that a presence entered the room, a light entered the room, and every particle, every molecule, basically just seemed to emanate this light and tremendous feelings of, good, love, security. Just, it was amazing. And my heart started pounding to the point where I was concerned I might have a heart attack. And I felt that there was a presence just above me, but I didn't see a personage. I didn't see, anything human. It just seemed brighter there. At that point, my bed began to dance on the floor, basically like a tap dance. And my bed was, fairly heavy. It was made out of birch wood. It wasn't a cheap bed. And I thought, so I had my eyes open a lot of the time during this process, because I was like hoping to like have a visitation from like the angel Moroni or something, right? At any rate, I thought, what the hell's going on? Is there like an earthquake going on or something? And so I looked around. I had these shelves attached to the wall. They were kind of screwed into the wall, this track kind of a thing, and where you just, anyway, so I had all my trophies from baseball, football, that kind of stuff on there, and a bunch of books and stuff. Nothing was moving at all. And my bed was doing a tap dance on the floor. Heart was pounding, and the room was lit up, and the feeling was beyond description. So it eventually, kind of dissipated, faded, and I was, left with this extremely strong spiritual experience, validating Mormonism completely in my mind, and my, just permeating me. So I was committed to, go for it as far as Mormonism went at that point, and I stopped smoking weed. I stopped, drinking anything, hard liquor or any kind of that. Not that I did a lot of that, but yeah, so I kind of pared things down, and not real long thereafter, I stopped even drinking beer, even though the word of wisdom said it's okay, basically. In the description of it as a mild drink of barley, I kind of weaned myself off of all word of wisdom violations, and I remained chaste in our relationship, etc. And I started going to church. And so after about the second week I went to church, the bishop comes down off of the stand, and he says, David, I perceive, that's what his words are, I perceive a change in you. Let's go talk in my office. So we did. We went and talked in his office. And, I went through the confession things, kind of spilled the beans, said, yeah, Bishop, I've been partying and all this kind of stuff. He's like, yeah, well, no shit. I know that. He didn't say no shit. But, he was kind of a down-to-earth guy. He's a pretty decent guy. I thought he was a decent guy. He really was. He and his wife took care of, their grandchildren. And they're really good people, actually. So, I told him, this was the week after I quit drinking beer, by the way. Yeah. So, so I'm feeling like, hey, the guy's got the gift of discernment. He knows. So we parted, and I walked. I was walking home. Actually, I walked over to a friend's house. It was kind of close to my house. Not super close, but, a long way from church. Church was on the other side of the town we lived in. So I get to my friend's house, and we start hanging out in his van a little bit. So it's Sunday afternoon. And then another friend, who was mainly a friend of his, comes over. And he's going, guys, and I had never done cocaine ever, but I had this kind of desire that I wanted to try it, It had been in my mind. So he comes over, this guy comes over, and he's like, guys, I was just at home thinking, God, it's a Sunday. God probably wants me to be nice and just share my coke. So I didn't want to just do it by myself. I came over to share, kind of like I don't think he said like Jesus would, but it's pretty close to that, right? So he breaks out a gram of cocaine, and man, I felt this temptation. And, he shows it, and I said, "Here, let me check that out." And I'd never even seen coke, but I touched my end of my tongue on it, and it just numbed it out. And I'm like, "That's the real stuff." And I go, "You know what, guys? I'm out of here. Not gonna do this. Have a great time. I'm gone." Because I felt like, you know what? Satan just brought this guy right here to tempt me before I was, really strong in my pattern of not breaking the word of wisdom, because I'm trying to be worthy and have the Holy Ghost and all that kind of stuff, which is what you're taught in Mormonism. The case is you are taught you've got the gift of the Holy Spirit once you're baptized and then confirmed member of the church, and specifically given this right to have the companionship of the Holy Ghost with you at all times, so long as you merit it through your compliance to Mormon, behavioral standards, etc., right? Keeping what are called the commandments. So, at any rate, there we are. I said, I'm out of here. I'm not going to... so I felt I was recognizing the devil trying to tempt me before I was, real strong at this. And there were several times, that I was tempted. We'd be out on Friday night, and, in my buddy's van, and my girlfriend would get high, everybody would get high, and then they pass a joint to me, and I'm like, no. And it was very difficult, but I kept telling myself, you go one more day, you're going to be proud, David. So, you can do this, you got to do this. And so that's what I did. And it was very difficult, but I succeeded in doing what I believed was the right thing. So I got myself, I stayed drug free, and I don't consider, whatever. Anyway, none of that stuff. No weed, no anything, right? No, not even a beer. Actually, let's confess, I had one beer a few months later, in October of 1978. We all went to some dance club, and I drank a Heineken before we went in. And that was the last time I ever had a beer. Actually, right before that, a few weeks before, we were camping. Nobody had any water, and I said, all right, well, I'll have a beer. So I had a beer, but that was, So anyway, those were my word of wisdom breaks, basically. Yeah. Maybe one thing that was not listed in the word of wisdom, but at any rate, just something from the garden store. I wound up marrying the girl. Bishop didn't call me on a mission. I told him, I'm not hoping you'll call me on a mission. He said, well, I'm not planning to, but I can't absolve you of that, but I'm not feeling inspired to call you or whatever. So that's the way that went. We got married, and I was 19 years old, and the bishop officiated at our wedding. So up to this point, so I've shared that I had some very strong confirmatory spiritual experiences. I've also not mentioned the fact that I was a healer prior to joining the LDS Church, meaning I healed people, I healed animals. I had developed some, very quickly actually, some the ability to do supernatural things in that venue. I had done a little bit of remote viewing, yeah, I felt pretty sketchy about the whole process as I got more into Mormonism, because Mormonism teaches that all these supernatural powers come through the channel, the authorized channel of the Mormon priesthood. So I had the Aaronic priesthood at that time, and I stopped. I told my family members, if you get a headache or anything, sorry, I can't. I'm not going to do anything here, right? There'd come up. We had all these birds dying around our house at one point. Somebody had put out a bunch of poison or something. I don't know exactly what the problem is, but we're filling up buckets with them. So I thought maybe I can heal these. And I've been doing these mind control classes where we had, and I thought, you know what? And I never read anything like up on witchcraft or any of this, but someone I'm close to now described, reading in her white witchcraft book, the process, describing pretty much exactly what just kind of came to me and what I did. So I projected this healing light, a green healing light, into these birds, and projected drawing toxins out with the other hand, the right hand. And the healing hand was the left hand, if that seems odd. And then I just I visualized casting the toxins into the wall. Bottom line is, the first bird I healed took like about 40 minutes. All the birds were just dying, but whatever ones I did this to, they'd get up and fly away. And it was going faster and faster and faster. It was just like magic. And I was just like, whoa, where's this power coming from? This is kind of spooky, because I'm not even having to concentrate hardly anymore. And, I do stuff like family had a headache or what, that was usually what it was. I'd take headaches away, kind of like Reiki maybe, right? So, I started feeling a little spooked as to where this power was coming from. So I said, you know what? I'm going to give this shit up. So I did. And so there I was, married and doing the church thing. And, there were just all kinds of challenges and trials. I became a stake missionary. And there I am, a stake missionary. And my mom invited some friends that she had experience with in the MLM thing, and spent some time with. The wife, the woman, was spent a fair amount of time with my mom, and my mom had given her the book Marvelous Work and a Wonder, and the gal thought, you know what, I really feel impressed about this stuff. So, and they'd been kind of new agey people. So I was one of the missionaries that went to talk to these folks, and so I was with one of the full-time elders, and I don't know how many discussions we were in, probably just a couple, probably about our third visit. The first one was really innocuous. It lowered their guard. We watched a just retarded movie called Johnny Lingo. Anyway, we did that, and it became kind of a joke with us. But I believe we were giving the second official discussion, the one on the plan of salvation in Mormonism, when I was giving one. And what happens in those, in case you don't know, you take turns. You and your compadre, your companion, your partner there, you take turns sharing, portions of the lesson, which are called concepts. And I was sharing a concept, and it was not that deep into the lesson, and I heard a voice that said, testify in the name of Jesus Christ. And I thought, that seems kind of weird right about now, maybe at the end of the lesson, right? So I continued on the concept I was teaching, and then the voice spoke again, right about the time I was about to get done with my spiel. And so I'm like, okay, whatever. And so I did. And, I said, I testify that what we're telling you is true in the name of Jesus Christ. As soon as I said Jesus Christ, boom, the room lit up, and everything was just like that time when the bed danced and all that stuff. And the people were just like, whoa, what the heck is going on? Because the presence, the energy that came into the room was just mind-blowing. And so it was, 3 children, mom and dad. And so dad was sitting, in like his special, I'm the dad chair, And then everybody else was like over on the couch or something, right? So he's facing me, and he put the palms of his hands up to like like all of this is in his hands, and he looks up at the ceiling, he looks all around, he goes, Dave, what is this? What is going on? What is this? And I said, it's the Spirit of the Lord testifying to the truth of our message. And they're like, wow. So they all got baptized, except for the youngest, who was 7 years old. And so Dad got the priesthood shortly thereafter and baptized 7-year-old when he became 8. They went to the temple, did all that kind of stuff, and then all the kids apostatized later, right? Daughter got pregnant when she was like 16. And they didn't live happily ever after, so far as Mormonism is concerned. But anyway, really nice people. And so that experience, again, to me, was super, super confirmatory. It's like, so I was to the point where I remember getting up when my dad came and visited one time. We were at like a priesthood meeting, and I got up, or maybe it was gospel doctrine, or just, anyway, whatever, some meeting in church, and I got up and I said, you know what? I'm at a point where I can't just say I believe, but I know that this is, what the church is what it claims to be. The vehicle for us to, accomplish what we need to become exalted beings, in our pathway in immortality, right? Towards immortality. So, I was absolutely convinced, and there were other experiences, I'm just not going to lay them all on you at this point, that gave me, a completely solid, spiritual confirmatory reference that I was in the one true church of the Israelite God and on the pathway to have eternal life. And so there, anyway, excuse me. With that mindset, gradually, over a period of time, I ran into experiences that were disturbing, that didn't seem to align with the Mormon truth and authority claims, which essentially are stating that an all-knowing, unchanging, omnipotent, omniscient, perfect God who's been perfected in all the attributes of godliness, I guess, would be, way of describing it. Merciful, just, wise, whatever, right? Was guiding the Mormon church, or that his son, Jesus Christ, who was in the same position, basically, a perfect being, was guiding the Mormon leaders, called prophets, seers, and revelators, even possibly giving personal visitations, because we were told that in the LDS temples, not the meeting houses, not the chapels, but the temples, where ordinances were performed on behalf of the dead, like baptisms for the dead, and then what's called the endowment, an endowment of knowledge and power and so forth to help people on their journey towards eternal life, and then what's called sealing, in other words, binding marriages and parents to children in an ordinance that is told to us as Mormons as being efficacious in eternity post-mortem, right? Whereas we are told that all covenants outside of that have an end when we are dead. That's according to what's called section 132 in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants, and was declared as a revelation to Joseph Smith, talking about eternal marriages and having families be together forever, and also that being a necessity for someone to become a god or a goddess. In other words, if you're not married in the LDS temple for all eternity and stay faithful to the end in that covenant and in all covenants with the Israelite God, then you basically are a servant to those who would be deemed more worthy in that condition. All right, so there we are. I've had all these confirmatory experiences, but then along the way, I'm starting to have experiences that contradict that. There are things that disturbed me. One of the things that disturbed me was the fact that Joseph Smith was a Freemason, and I read in the Book of Mormon things that were very along the same lines as we were studying in the John Birch Society regarding basically an evil secret society or group of secret societies that would be seeking to destroy the freedom of people and establish essentially what's often called the New World Order, or a government over the whole earth under the power of Satan. So the Book of Mormon talks about this secret combination. Basically, it's describing illuminated Freemasonry. And I was deeply disturbed that Joseph Smith would be joining the Freemasons. I was living at times with the first family when I, first started going out with a girl who became my wife. He was a Master Mason. Her father was, of course, a Master Mason, or she couldn't have been in Job's Daughters, right? She was the reigning queen at that time. So, and that guy was a guy I did not get along with at all. So, at any rate, I came back to visit the other fellow and the family, and one day, and he after I had been through the LDS temple and received what they call signs, tokens, and penalties for revealing the signs and tokens and so forth. And this fellow was drunk, and he was goofing around and saying, "Oh, let me show you this handshake I learned from, some of the brothers that where I work." He was prison guard, and he's showing these silly handshakes. And then he goes, "I'm not supposed to show you this one." And then he gave me a grip that's used in the LDS temple and is considered basically the most sacred, holy grip. It's the final grip before going through the veil in the temple. Or it is also used over the altars during the sealing ordinance. And so Mormons are taught that this is like super sacred, right? And he gives me that grip. And I said, "What is that?" Which is what you ask in the Mormon ceremony at the veil, where you're mimicking, you're pretending you're talking to, the Mormon God, right? And so I said, "What is that?" And he told me it was from Freemasonry, and I was like, "Wow!" So Mormonism is sharing that they've got the Mormon grip, or the Mormons, Anyway, so my point of view at that point was, and I may have asked the bishop about it. I believe I did. So anyway, I'm basically told that, well, the Masons stole it from, the temple, where they were peeking when the priesthood was doing this sort of thing in the Temple of Solomon. That's kind of what we were told, or what I came to, was told. So I thought that was pretty weird. Later, I had other experiences that linked Freemasonry with Mormonism. I was in the temple after the endowment had changed. It changed in 1990, and certain things were dropped from it. The penalties, the demonic penalties of the Freemasons, which were slitting your throat, that kind of a thing, ripping your tongue out, or being disemboweled, those things, they were dropped, as well as some other scenes involving a Protestant preacher, that kind of a thing, being employed by Satan. And something called the 5 Points of Fellowship, which was employed at the Veil and involved being, your knee to knee, arm to back, ear to mouth, whatever, breast to breast. And so upon the 5 Points of Fellowship, you were having, things whispered to you that were like secret tokens, right? And so there I was sitting in presentation of the endowment, and a voice spoke to me and said, Google the 5 Points of Fellowship. So when I went home, I Googled the 5 Points of Fellowship, and it said nothing about Mormonism. It was all Freemasonry and the legend of Hiram Abiff in Freemasonry. And I'm like, why do we have this Freemasonry in here? That disturbed me. So I wound up reading, that Joseph Smith joined the Freemasons March 15th, and during the time between March 15th and March 16th, he amazingly completed what he needed to do to gain the first 3 degrees of Freemasonry, or in other words, complete, the what you needed to do to be raised to the office of a Master Mason, the 3rd degree in Freemasonry, basically the highest degree in what's called the Blue Lodge. And within that lodge, later I just happened to be looking on the internet, I saw the grips that were being used and the signs that were being used, and they all corresponded to what we had in the LDS temple. And then I saw the penalties, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's what we're pantomiming. I read what the penalties were, and I realized we got this from Freemasonry. And then I noticed that Joseph Smith altered the LDS Endowment to contain these things 7 weeks after joining the Freemasons, after having had these signs and tokens and so forth given to him. And I had been told, no, they stole it from the priesthood anciently. But now I realized, okay, Joseph Smith joined the Freemasons, was shown these things, and then put it in the endowment, not the other way around. He stole them from the Freemasons. And I realized I had done enough studying to see that, at some point I realized, I read what Albert Pike wrote, who was, head of all Freemasonry in North America at the time of his death, I believe. And during the Civil War, he was head of the Southern jurisdiction. And he stated that Lucifer was God, and that he called it the Masonic religion, and stated that the brethren of the higher degrees needed to preserve the pure Luciferian doctrine, and they were deeply associated with the Illuminati, and everything that the Book of Mormon was telling us was satanic. So I just, this didn't comport too well with LDS Truth and Authority claims, especially since we were taught that Joseph Smith could obtain a revelation from the Israelite God pretty much any time he wanted to, whether it was about where someone was going on a mission, or to get this word of wisdom I spoke about earlier, or all kinds of other revelations. Yet instead of just getting a revelation on what's the most special secret handshake that you need to be able to show an angel or you won't get into heaven, that's actually taught in Mormonism. Brigham Young said that we would, in the temple, obtain the signs and tokens that we needed in order to pass by the angels who stood as sentinels and receive our exaltation despite earth and hell. So we were taught, and I was running an LDS bookstore, etc., I did a lot of reading. I read what Brigham Young had to say, and I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Joseph Smith had to join a Luciferian religion in order to gain these things that he should have been able to have the Israelite God give to him. And he's joining a religion when he was told specifically not to go, join other churches or anything like that, right? He said, go not after them. He's joining something that's, essentially satanic. And although people at the lower levels probably have no idea, just like in Mormonism, right, or any other organizations, the guys at the top that are the Luciferians, and then they got these charitable organizations and stuff, and people that just that wind up doing free labor for them, and they have no clue. But that's the way it works in all these religions, right? Anyway, I could see that we had a major problem. And along the way, I'd read some things that were disturbing. Got on the internet and wasn't looking for anything faith-shaking, but I ran into an article, a story by a grandson of Ezra Taft Benson, who was, an apostle and became the president of the LDS Church, and who was also a big advocate for the John Birch Society, so that we could, preserve our freedoms from the communists who were inspired by Satan, basically, right? So there we are, and his grandson, who was going to BYU, and had served a mission, I guess, already, and was taking science classes, and so in his evolution, they're being taught organic evolution, and then in his religion classes, he's being taught, something completely different. And so he's like trying to reconcile this stuff, and he asks his grandpa, what do you think? Can I get an answer from the prophet? Since since there isn't any statements on it, and so his grandfather starts couriering letters from Steve Benson to president of the church, Spencer W. Kimball. And what I noticed in the story is basically Spencer Kimball is just kind of like, kind of weaseling, kind of just, he won't give him a straight answer. He's like saying, why don't you look at this book or that book? I mean, he's supposed to be like the spokesman for the Israelite God, and all he's doing is sidestepping the issue here. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty weird. So, another big thing that happened was my son, who was, let's just say he was like 16. So he was my fourth child with my first wife, and we were divorced at this point, and I was married to wife number 2, and I'd homeschooled my son, and he was brilliant and did a lot of reading, and he said, "Hey, Dad, the American Indians, they're not Lamanites. Just thought you might want to know that. There have been DNA studies done, and they're not Israelites. They're Siberian people." And about this time, I'd already been reading a book by David Icke called The Greatest Secret. And in that book, he talks about the state of Israel being inhabited by Khazarian Jews. In other words, people from the Khazarian kingdom, basically, which converted to Judaism. We're on the years like 700 or something like that. So these guys were not what you would consider Israelites, but they seemed to be, the de facto leader of Judaism at the time, and were the heads of state, basically, there in Israel, which was created, because Second World War, Adolf Hitler was fulfilling what Albert Pike told Giuseppe Manzini was going to happen, and creating a reason to establish like the Anti-Defamation League, the League of Nations, the United Nations, and the State of Israel. to have the sympathy for these of the Jews, because these Jews have been, massacred in the Holocaust there, right? So this was a British financed thing. It's sometimes it's referred to as the state of Rothschild. And so I thought, well, you know what? I can explain half of this here with this part, right? We don't have Israelites inhabiting Israel right now, so I can see how it wouldn't match. The problem that I couldn't find a way to reconcile, however, was that these people had their DNA, the Lamanites, as we had been called, had Siberian DNA, and there wasn't a solution for that. So I began, looking. I read stuff on Fair Mormon, and then I saw a Fair Mormon presentation at BYU. I saw this like a tape of it, on, I don't know, YouTube, something like that. And what they were presenting was they were presenting what we now have in the Mormon, on LDS.org or churchofjesuschrist.org in the Gospel Topics essay on DNA in the Book of Mormon. Their premise has now been adopted as, what the apostles and first presidency of the LDS Church state is the case, which was that the Lamanites just disappeared into this huge, this sea of people that were already in the Americas, which is contrary to what the Book of Mormon states was the case. The Book of Mormon tells us that the land was washed clean. In the waters, presumably the waters of the flood of Noah is what they're talking about, in which Jeffrey Holland, an LDS apostle who was then head of BYU and a 70, said, definitely confirmed this, was talking about the flood of Noah, and saying that it washed, wiped out everybody in North America, or everybody in the world except for these 8 people. And they became repeopled by the Jaredites, and then later by the family of Lehi and family of Ishmael, and the bad guys survived in the all-out war there between the Nephites and the Lamanites, and the Lamanites became the American Indians. And now we were hearing that now these Siberian folks that are here now, and obviously weren't washed away by Noah's flood either, were so numerous that the Lamanites just disappeared into them. That's what the church tells us now in the Gospel Topics essay, and that's what these guys were presenting at that time. And I'm like, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You've just wiped out the whole flood of Noah thing, and the church affirms that that's true, and now you're saying it couldn't be, or else these folks wouldn't be there. Not only that, they've been there since 9,000 years before Adam was the first flesh on earth, according to Joseph Smith, right? In the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, in the portion that's canonized in the LDS scriptures there in the Book of Moses, it says he was the first flesh on earth, the first man also, and that's, basically shown to be 6,000 years ago. So, yeah, it's a big problem, basically, trying to say that the Book of Mormon is plausible, but you've just thrown out the Bible that it says it's based on. So, on this whole theme that Adam and Eve lived in Missouri starting 6,000 years ago, right? Nevertheless, these pre-Adamite people who were not washed away by the fake news flood of Noah just enveloped the Lamanites, whom the Book of Mormon said had the land unto themselves as a promise from God. So the essay says it doesn't say that, but it does say that. Yeah. So I kind of put that thing, I put that on the shelf a little bit, and what actually was bothering me the most was the Freemason thing with Joseph Smith. Knowing that he had to have gotten those aspects of the Mormon endowment from Freemasonry and had to join this Luciferian religion of Freemasonry to do so. And that just didn't work for me. And I was praying and praying and praying. I was looking for the angel Moroni to come and tell me, how this could possibly be. Because I thought, even though there's no kind of, spiritual confirmation that's going to be good enough, I need an explanation from an angel. And it was about that time that I also read, maybe I was studying, trying to look for answers, when my prayers weren't getting me, something that would help me to reconcile this stuff that was just blowing it was just eating away at me. I saw a site called the Wives of Joseph Smith.org, I believe, and I learned that in addition to the polygamy, which I already had believed was the case, and because I was taught that I'd have to accept polygamy probably eventually, when it would be restored, right? That's what was being taught in those days. I learned that he took the wives of like 11 dudes, took their wives, and was supposedly sealed to most or all of those 11 for time and all eternity. So basically stole these dudes' wives. It's like, hey, sorry, sucker, I just took your wife, which was your basic reason for living this whole thing, so you could stay together with your family, so you're starting over, go get somebody else. And that was kind of the straw that broke, the camel's back for me. I just said that's just not acceptable. That's horrible. That's wrong. That's evil. And none of this works for me. At this point, I can't be okay with him, joining Freemasonry to get this. I'm not getting any answers. The more I pray, the more I just feel like you just got to study more. And I started reading on a site called Mormon Think at that point, which was pretty organized on a subject-by-subject basis, kind of like my website here is, which goes topic by topic, except for I incorporate videos into the subject matter here, which is something I started doing later. But I realized Mormonism was a big lie. And I saw contradiction after contradiction. 2008, I just kind of did the math on the third Nephi story, where Jesus blesses each one of the little children of 2,000 men, and seems like he does it in like less than an hour based on the story, the way it looks, and because of other activities they're doing. And I realized, if it was like even a 1-minute blessing, it would have taken like 16 hours even without a piss break. So I'm like, you know what? This stuff never happened. And then I began seeing thing after thing that was, all these contradictions within the LDS canon of Scripture. So, I was about to pay tithing. We were living outside the United States. I was starting to walk from the church to the bank to hit the ATM up, and I just thought, you know what? I'm not going to pay this tithing until I know that, unless I can resolve this and believe that the church is, honestly what it claims to be, despite all of my spiritual experiences. And that's what really made it hard, was because I had been played like good guy, bad guy with the spiritual entities to get me to believe that the LDS Church was what it claimed to be. Nevertheless, Jesus Christ was contradicting himself within Mormon Scripture. Time after time, I would see contradiction. And, I learned about the Book of Abraham being just complete fraud. Where Joseph Smith said that he translated an Egyptian document from the time of Abraham, which would be presumably around 2200 BC, but the document wasn't from that time. It was about the current era. There were just a couple thousand years off, and the document has, surfaced since that time, and had absolutely nothing to do with what Joseph Smith said it did. Additionally, Joseph Smith had gone to the trouble of augmenting all that just to show people how skilled he was with translating foreign, ancient languages, and he had rendered samples of the Egyptian alphabet, the Egyptian hieroglyphics as an alphabet, and he was wrong about every single thing that he supposedly translated. The text was filled with anachronisms and false information, whether it be, saying that Egypt means that which is forbidden, or Pharaoh means king by royal birth. We're talking about the Chaldeans, 1,000 years before they actually would have been where it said they were. So there were just multiple things, and then the crazy stuff like, our sun getting its light and power through some weird magical force from Kolob in the center of, the universe or something, right? Just really weird stuff. And of course, there's the God the Father sitting on his throne business, which is really Pharaoh, because we've got Egyptologists that have translated this stuff, and Pharaoh's sitting there on his throne, waiting for one of his wives to jump on his lap. He's ready to go, and in a state of sexual excitement, made obvious by the picture, and Joseph Smith says that's God the Father, and he's just talking to the Holy Ghost and Abraham about the priesthood with his pants off and a stiff Twinkie. So I'm like, oh my God, this is just bullshit. Yeah. You don't even really notice that. It's in facsimile too in the Book of Abraham, and it's kind of the bottom half of that circular facsimile is, upside down, and it's kind of small, and you just don't notice it. But you take, you blow it up a little bit and put it right side up. You're like, holy shit, that's like gay porn. And that's the Mormon God, talking to two dudes about the grand key words of the priesthood, according to Joseph Smith, with his trousers off and it's like, you gotta be kidding me. There ain't nothing that could be exciting enough to talk to two dudes about it in that kind of a situation. That's it's too gay for me. So I said, and this is the same God that says you got to kill people because if they're queer, right? In Leviticus chapter 20. So it's once again completely inconsistent with the Mormon narrative of who and what God is. So this and numerous other things I saw about that time. My daughter, I was visiting, and we were talking about interesting things pertaining to the United States, Freemasonry and stuff. She said, I saved something from you and for you, Dad, and it was a newspaper article about a site called Stay LDS or something, basically portraying that Mormon people could go to that for some refuge from the shit they were finding out about the church that was not congruent with the LDS truth and authority claims. From there, I was able to research some of these topics that I was already concerned about. I'm like, wow, other people noticed that shit about the Freemasons and Joseph Smith? Because no one told me about it. I just noticed it. So, so there were a number of things. And I watched something from John DeLynn, who made a video that said why people leave the LDS Church, and basically kind of gave a little brief description of, I don't know, maybe about 10 points, that were not congruent with the stated LDS truth and authority claims. So that's when I began doing further research, and I just, because of the experiences I'd had, I was just like, David, you got to be sure, because if you bail, if you walk off on the church, I mean, you're a son of perdition. You've had these strong spiritual witnesses, the denial of the Holy Ghost is not a denial of the Jesus dude. It's if you read about it, it's denying a spiritual experience, and the Spirit had testified that the church was true. So, and the Spirit said that basically was like giving you get these feelings about the LDS scriptures, which were self-contradictory, which means the spirit is a liar. It says that things are true which are have contradiction within them. So that's pretty much the definition of testifying that things which are not true are true. So yeah, I wanted to not make a mistake because I figured I'd be rotting in hell forever, right? I mean, the programming was so strong and the experiences I had were so strong that I didn't think I could ever be swayed, except for I'm looking at contradiction after contradiction in LDS scriptures, whether it's, Jesus, who was saying that he is God the Father and Jesus all in one in Ether chapter 3 of the Book of Mormon, stating that, no one has ever seen him before. He shows himself to the brother of Jared, which would have been about 2100 BC, whereas you have him saying the same kind of a thing in the Book of Moses, chapter 7, to Enoch, and he's like, hey, you can see me here. I'm speaking to you like one man is speaking to another right here, you can see me. Except for that would have been, like about 1100 years previous in the story line, historically. So I'm like, wait a minute. And Joseph Smith said the Book of Mormon's true. He said Jesus told him. Book of Mormon's full of changes. And, yeah, it was just one thing after another, an avalanche of incongruency and making you look and go, God, how did I not notice all this shit before, right? But there had been some things that I had put on the shelf, but at this point it was an avalanche, and I decided, you know what? So when I saw the Wives of Joseph Smith thing, I showed that to my wife. She had bailed her first marriage because her husband was cheating on her. So, something promoting that kind of infidelity was particularly offensive to her, and we just stopped going to church. Besides that, we didn't really have the money to get there very easily. We ran into some financial problems. The business I was in had gone down the tubes at that point through the mortgage crisis, which was why we were living in Central America in the first place, trying to preempt that. But, we'd gotten to the point where things were pretty tight, and bus money, to go that far. It was a 7-hour day going to church for us because of bus rides and so forth where we were. It wasn't easy. You're sitting in plastic seats in 90, 100, 100 degree weather, 105 sometimes. Not easy. But we were very dedicated, trying to gain eternal life with our family, right? And we had a change of venue and work after a rough time there, and we got involved with tourism. And about that time, I got a phone call from my son, who had returned to the United States shortly after we had left in 06, and he informed me that he was hooked on heroin. So when the rainy season came, we said, you know what? We've saved a little bit of money. Let's risk everything, go up and try to save him. So we went by land so that my wife wouldn't have to have a plane ticket out of there. She was not born in North America, and there would have been, anyway, there was immigration type complications. So we stayed, and he got off heroin. It wasn't easy, and it took too long. We lost our business. We were unable to return to our home. Got stuck in the United States, and wound up going to Mexico because we ran out of time here for her, and things got rough. I wound up having a nervous breakdown. She left, took the children, our children, and I was already in a nervous breakdown at that point. My nervous system had given out. I had been under too much stress for too long, too much time in the sympathetic nervous system, destroying it, among other things, and plus demonic buffeting, I could say. And it only got worse after she left. So my son was there. We had stayed with we wound up with my mom after after we were in Mexico for a little while, and she split with the kids, and I was gone down the tubes. And later my son said he was going to leave. He had started going to school, and then he formed a company and was doing great with it, rebuilding people's MacBooks and reprogramming them and so forth. He was all self-taught, getting orders over the internet every day, and then he wound up going to New York and Europe and Berkeley and was murdered there. So that was a couple of years into my breakdown. 3 years basically, shy by a week or 2 weeks of my wife having left. So Halloween of 2016, my oldest son was visited by the police, who had identified the body of my son. And I still have not seen my youngest son since 11, 12, 13, when she left with the children. And I saw my little girl for a few minutes, and that was it. 2 occasions, a couple of minutes, and didn't have the holding power to stay when I went out to visit them. New Year's of 2017, I started making videos to expose the Mormon Church for what it is. I now believe I have probably the largest collection of video-based material, specifically outlining the false history and the mind control, the abusive, teachings and so forth in the church, in the world. And the following year on New Year's, put up a website, which we're looking at, one of the pages right here, which incorporates videos on pages that are specifically geared to particular Mormon truth and authority claims. Yeah. So, I got about 500 videos out, I think, on Mormonism and the cog in the larger wheel that it is. And it's called Mormon Truth Videos Gospel Topics. I was 4 years unable to really enter life, reintegrate, and began going outside, and I'm currently a nomad, working and continuing this project, and trying to regain, establish myself economically and reestablish my credit, etc., and get in a position where I could be in my children's lives, those younger ones, my older ones, and one who's an LDS lawyer, doesn't spend a lot of time with me these days, but he has spent a little bit of time with me when he felt that he was morally obligated to, maybe, despite the teaching to shun people who are against the brethren, which I clearly am. And of course, the new temple worthiness questions are slightly different than the old. Some of them, or at least one pertaining to that, is so he would still be able to get a temple recommend, even if he was associating with me, I suppose, or doing anything helpful. Which he did recently when my car was broken down. So he came and helped me and brought me some tranny fluid. So, how's that for an intro? For those who might be looking at this as an introduction to my journey in Mormonism, and without it going too long, I had to overcome a lot of programming and confirmatory spiritual experiences that I cannot attribute to, warm fuzzies or anything just psychological. I've had a number of experiences, including other ones where the physical world was affected by the unseen world. I don't consider myself to be an atheist, but I'm definitely against the Israelite God and his partner Satan, which helps him herd people into the Christian religion and Mormonism and other spin-offs of the Abrahamic religions. Okay. I'm going to wind this one up then. Throw stuff in the description of the video that's useful for promoting this, and like, subscribe, contribute in any way that you think is going to be helpful, according as I say in the other videos. And I'm signing off. Have a great weekend.